Hey everyone, welcome to, I think this is day 4 of our daily devotion. It's Friday and the weekend is here, although our weekend may not look much different than what our week was, particularly those in isolation and quarantine and whatnot. But we've been working our way through the book of Hebrews, and so we find ourselves in Hebrews chapter 11. And I suspect that if you know anything about Hebrews, you know a little bit about this chapter. It's known as the Faith Hall of Fame, where the writer of Hebrews walks us through many of the Old Testament saints and how they demonstrated faith. Well, in order to understand this, let's start in the first 3 verses. We'll do a lot of summarization. It is a long chapter, but I think you'll be really blessed by what he has to say in this chapter. Excuse me. Well, the first 3 verses is the thesis of this chapter. He says, "Now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. For by it the people of old received their commendation. By faith we understand that the universe was created by the word of God, so that what is seen was not made out of things that are visible." A couple things to note here about this thesis. First of all, faith is related to both assurance and hope. Though we do not see things now, we hope with great assurance they will be seen one day. So it's the holding fast of a promise, to possess the faith that rooted in those promises that God has given us. So throughout the Old Testament, God makes promises to his saints that often they don't see in their lifetimes. One example of this, and we'll see it in our passage here, is Abraham, who was promised the land of Israel, Canaan, but he never sees it. He dies still a sojourner. In fact, it isn't until centuries later, after Israel have been sojourners and slaves, it's in the generation of Joshua they finally take possession of the land. So faith is the assurance of things hoped for, not necessarily the evidence of things seen. Well, we also see verse 2, faith is what saves and sustains us, that the people of old received their commendation. It was by faith they received that. Then we also need to know, verse 3, that faith lies at the core of our identity. God created everything. That is to say that the invisible created the visible. So our identity, who we are, is in him. That's a matter of faith. Because it's easy for us to surrender our identity to the gods of our age or to what the world may tell us who we are. But no, our faith is in a God of our creation who is also the God of our redemption. Well, to lay out this thesis, he walks us through the Old Testament, giving us multiple examples. He actually starts to run out of space of these champions of faith. And he has a few points to make regarding what faith is or why it matters. First of all, he says, faith pleases God. It pleases God. To live by faith pleases God. And he gives us really 3 examples, but the first 2 are particularly rich. The first is Abel. Abel pleased God, Cain killed him. And in verse 7, Enoch pleased God, and Enoch didn't die. What a contrast we have right off the bat between verse 6 and 7. In verse 6, pleasing God led to death. Verse 7, pleasing God led to life, eternal life. What's the point there? Is what matters isn't what becomes of us or what people think of us. What matters is pleasing God. I think one of the things we've had to learn the hard way through this crisis is a lot of things we put a lot of energy and thought into don't matter right now, do they? Sports, politics, entertainment, what someone is going to wear on the red carpet at whatever celebrity event is about to happen. None of that really matters, does it? What does matter? Faith, family, these things. Faith pleases God. In fact, notice what he says in verse 6. And without faith it is impossible to please him. Whoever would draw near to God must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who seek him. Without faith you can't please God. And to illustrate that, give another example, he gives Noah, who pleased God through the building of the ark, even though it hadn't rained on the earth yet, and everyone would have mocked him for that. He was a preacher of righteousness, we learn from Peter, and by faith he built that ark. So first of all, faith pleases God. But notice secondly, faith obeys God. It obeys God. This is verses 8 through 16. Often whenever we ask our kids to do something or not to do something, they'll protest, like I did when I was their age. Every kid has done this. So one of the things my wife and I like to do is we like to remind them that, do we, as your parents, not love you? Have we not shown over these many years our deep, abiding love and affection for you? Then I need you to trust me that when I ask you to do this thing that you don't want to do, it isn't because I want to torture you. It is because I love you. The same is with God. You cannot separate obedience to God and the love of God. For what he asks of us is rooted in his love, not because he's a killjoy sort of father. And that's what he says here, that faith obeys God. And he starts with Abraham and Sarah, and this really is his focus here, that Abraham and Sarah demonstrate this. Notice that they left home, became sojourners in a strange land. This was a massive issue at the time. To move involved more than hiring a moving company or getting a U-Haul for a day. It would involve moving your entire lifestyle and who you know and your extended family. To leave all of that behind. Yet by faith, he obeyed God. By faith, they continued to try to conceive. In fact, the language says that though dead, they gave life. And of course, Abraham and Sarah weren't literally dead, but they were elderly, and they believed the promise, and so they obeyed God by faith. So that decades after that promise was made to them, they gave birth and raised Isaac. So faith pleases God and faith obeys God, but faith also holds fast to the promises of God. This is verse 13 to 31. And notice the examples he gives. We go back to Abraham, in that Abraham, believing the promises made about his son, still offered up his son as a sacrifice at the top of the mountain. Why? Because Hebrews tells us. He believed in the promise so much, he thought that if God asks me to do this and I do it, God will still raise him from the dead. Believing in resurrection. Isaac blessed both of his sons based off of the promise. Jacob did the same thing with his 12 sons we see here. Moses' mother hid him by faith, believing that God would redeem his people. Moses led the people out of Egypt. The Israelites practiced the Passover while still slaves, believing the promise that they were not going to be slaves. Rahab believed in the hope of Israel, that Israel would be spared, right? Remember that she let the spies in and she put the sign out of where she was. She believed that because of who the God of Israel was, she would be spared, and she was. And we read about her in the genealogy of Jesus. There is a prostitute in the line of Jesus. What an amazing promise of grace that is. You see, that our beloved saints that have gone before us, they knew that faith pleased God, and they understood that faith leads to obedience to God, but they also understood that faith requires us to hold fast to the promises of God, even when it seems unlikely to happen. And God has made us some amazing promises to our lives. And perhaps the most significant is that those who call upon the name of the Lord will be saved. God has promised to be with us wherever we may be, and whatever struggles we may have, God will be there with us. And right now we're having to learn that the hard way, aren't we? Or maybe we're having to learn it again through this virus. The last thing he shows us is that faith suffers well. This is verses 32 to 40. And he breaks this down into two parts, right? He gets to a point where he's running out of space, right? And if he were to keep going into detail, right, the parchment is only so long, so he's got to summarize this chapter, right? And so he starts just summarizing, and some of these events he describes could include multiple of the Old Testament saints. So notice he starts verse 32 of Hebrews 11. He says, "And what more shall I say? For time would fail me to tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel, and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, were made strong out of weakness, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight, and women received back their dead by resurrection." Notice here he describes the triumphs of faith, right? I mean, on one end, he just says, oh, guys, I could tell you about Samson and David and Jephthah and Barak and so many others. We could just go through the whole Bible and show you what great things the people of God have done. And he summarizes them, right? Women receive back their dead. They conquer kingdoms. They enforce justice. They attain promises. They stop the mouths of lions. And I bet whenever you hear those events, a number of people come to mind. Who stopped the mouths of lions? Well, off the top of my head, Daniel, obviously. Samson is another, right? David, would have wrestled bears and lions as a shepherd. Who enforced justice? Well, the great kings of Israel did that. The righteous kings who conquered kingdoms and put back to flight the enemies of God. Well, so many people did, right? Particularly the kings and their generals, some of the prophets, right? I mean, the stories are endless here. It was by faith they triumphed in these ways. But that's not where the chapter ends, is it? It's almost like he sets us up before that with faith you can do anything, and you can. But there's the rest of the chapter we have to take seriously, right? So we see not just the triumph of faith, we see the travail of faith. Yes, faith pleases God, and we're called to obey God. We're called to believe the promises of God. But by faith, we're called to suffer well. That means life will be full of a lot of triumphs. Like life was a week or two ago, right? Economy was strong. We were moving forward without a care in the world. We saw a disease come, we thought, well, that'll never affect us, will it? There's a lot of triumphs of faith. There's also a lot of travails in faith. Notice what he says starting in verse 35. Halfway through verse 35. He says, some were tortured, refusing to accept release so that they might rise again to a better life. Others suffered mocking and flogging, even chains and imprisonments. They were stoned, they were sawn in two. They were killed with the sword. They went about in skins of sheep and goats, destitute, afflicted, mistreated, of whom the world was not worthy. Wandering about in deserts and mountains, in dens and caves of the earth. And all these, though commended through their faith, did not receive what was promised. See, God had provided something better for us, that apart from us, they should not be made perfect. Now, we love that first part, right? Stopping the mouths of lions, putting to flight the enemy. We don't like that other part, right? Tortured, sawn in two, left desolate in wilderness and dens and caves. And there it is. Their suffering wasn't because of a lack of faith, but their faith led to much of this. But what separates people of faith and non-faith isn't do they suffer, but do they suffer well? Who do you turn to if you do not have the Savior of this world? You can't turn to yourself. You're an emotional mess. You can't turn to this world. What hope is there in that? And we must live by faith. See, it's no accident that the writer concludes the chapter reminding them of reality. We all suffer. Yet faith will get us through if we suffer well by faith. So what does it mean then to suffer well? It means that rooted in faith, we look to the promises of God, which are bigger than the travails, and I would add plagues, of this world. So are you right now living by faith? Does your faith please God? Do you seek to obey God? Do you hold fast to the promises of God? And in this moment of national and international crisis, are you suffering well for the glory of God? They will know us by our fruit, right? And they'll know our fruit by our faith. Lord willing, we'll see you guys next Monday as we continue this series of devotions. And we trust that you are hanging in there. And if you have any questions or comments, don't hesitate to comment below. Thank you, guys.